So, for those of you that have been following this series of videos regarding book recommendations, you know that I originally had been speaking about the Perennial Philosophy by Aldous Huxley, as well as What the Buddha Taught by Rahula, and then went on to discuss the Diamond Sutra, as well as then subsequently the Lotus Sutra, giving some excerpts from the Lotus Sutra as part of this series. And I think that it has been clear that what I have been trying to do is create a set of recommendations that evolves one from the generalized notion of there being a variety of religious approaches that humans have explored and devised and created and discovered over the course of time, but that, again, for my own journey, I have focused in on Buddhism, having evolved from a more traditional meditation oriented kind of approach to the great vehicle, the Mahayana. And of course, within the Mahayana, we have the Diamond Sutra, which is so profound in terms of essentially giving us the insight of sunyata, or emptiness, or the void, namely that no thing, including no person, has a totally independent self-existence. And this is a tough kind of insight to really grasp onto, because it involves not grasping whatsoever, as a matter of fact. But in the context then of this sort of world wherein words and concepts and doctrines and theories and texts cannot have ultimate meaning, we're left with the question of, well, how do we describe, how do we put in words, how do we put in a text the meaning of what humans tend to experience as spiritual realities, other than to be able to negate that any particular way of thinking is absolutely true. And that's where we lead into the Lotus Sutra from the perspective of this sort of crude chronology, where we learn about the profound teaching of upaya, or skillful means, where it's made explicit that the way the Buddha teaches is through a variety of approaches that are geared to the mentalities and psychologies and cultural circumstances of particular human beings across the globe. And what we also learn in the Lotus, I think, or at least I see the seeds of it, is that while the Bodhisattva path is touted as very meritorious, in the sense that, again, the Bodhisattva makes the vow, the commitment to save all beings and to defer his or her own enlightenment pending his or her ability to provide comfort and support to beings in their suffering, that, not everybody can do that. And so there is, again, the seed of an easy path. Actually, this seed was planted long before, even by Nagarjuna, considered to be the first patriarch of many of the Mahayana traditions, when he makes the first distinction between the difficult path and the easy path. But in any case, once we have the seed of this easy path, we see the evolution within Buddhism of a variety of more other power kinds of oriented approaches, most notably by the tradition of Pure Land Buddhism. And of course, Pure Land went through its own evolution, as articulated by Shinran Shonin in 13th century Japan, as being sort of exemplified by the 7 patriarchs that he identified, although there were certainly many others along this path who clarified various aspects of the teaching. But in any case, this went on through Honen, who was Shinran's teacher, who really put an emphasis on simply saying the name, saying the Nembutsu, Namo Amida Butsu, as the methodology for gaining rebirth in the Pure Land, for becoming a Buddha eventually, since rebirth in the Pure Land represented a place where we would not have the hindrances that we have in association with this bodily form, these 3 poisons of anger, greed, and ignorance. So what Shinran did then is he refined this Pure Land or easy path to its ultimate degree, into a system of pure grace. Again, keeping in mind that no doctrine, no concept system, we need to keep this in mind from the perspective of the Diamond Sutra, and also the Lotus, which is basically built on the Mahayana notion of non-form, that we that we still, as human beings, have a need, have a desire, have it is a need to be able to articulate our experience of spirituality with some kind of doctrine, with some kind of concept system, with some kind of way of thinking. And this is where I want to highlight in this particular video a recommendation of the Tannisho. And the one that I focused on mostly back in the day when I first had my spiritual awakening was this particular version, which is called Tannisho, a primer. Now, the Tannisho is actually not a book that was authored by Shinran, even though Shinran was prolific. He wrote many things, including his masterwork, the Gao Gao Shinsho, as well as many gathas or verses or poems trying to communicate to his followers about the Pure Land and his way of conceptualizing the Pure Land. But the Tannisho was actually written by a follower of Shinran called Yenbo. But it's so beautifully written and so clearly written in terms of, Yenbo's sort of reporting to us as to what Shinran said, both directly about the teaching as well as in response to various questions pertaining to the teaching, that it is really a gem of insight into the true Pure Land school of Buddhism, or Jodo Shinshu, or what we call now Shin Buddhism, as well as a form of literature that's quite sublime. So the subtitle of the Tannisho is A Record of the Words of Shinran Set Down in Lamentation Over Departures from His Teaching. And this particular volume was translated by Dennis Hirota. But again, this particular volume may not be easily accessible, and really there are many, many translations out there of the Tannisho, and I would strongly encourage anybody interested in a more faith-oriented or other power-oriented approach to get hold of a copy or even more than one translation of this wonderful work, the Tannisho. Again, without getting hung up on this particular volume, let me say a couple of things. So we have the Dharmakaya, okay? We have the law body or the truth body. This is the body of Buddha, and I'm referring now to the Trikaya or the three-body doctrine within Mahayana Buddhism. The Dharmakaya is the body of Buddha that's beyond all words and concepts. And in some sense, while a fundamental notion within the early form of Buddhism is impermanence, and that's a very valuable notion, because when we really get in touch with us being made up of the skandhas and of the constantly evolving nature of the various causes and conditions that cause us to be who we are right at this very moment, we are somebody different in a sense at the next very moment. And so impermanence in that sense is very fundamental. But within Mahayana Buddhism, we do have a sense in which there is a kind of eternality, and that would be, in my opinion, the Dharmakaya or the Alaya Vijnana, to put it in Yogacaran or terms related to the Lankavatara Sutra. In any case, it's this Dharmakaya that then manifests itself. It emanates into the Sambhogakaya and the Nirmanakaya, namely the bliss body and the form body. So the form body is easy. That is when the Dharmakaya manifests itself in the context of an actual human being. This would be like, for example, Jesus or Sakyamuni Buddha. In other words, a human being that embodies the sense of deep compassion for human beings and works to try to relieve the suffering of humans in the context of an actual incarnate form. Now, the Sambhogakaya is a little more difficult to get a handle on in some sense. I think of it as a world or a universe, really, or even a multiverse of myriad Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, cosmic Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And within that framework, we see some of the great, what they call in the Mahayana Sutras, the Bodhisattva Mahasattvas, the great cosmic Bodhisattvas like Kuan Yin or Manjushri or Samantabhadra or Jizo, all these wonderful bodhisattvas. But we also have Buddhas, many Buddhas, such as Medicine Buddha, such as Vairocana Buddha. And we also have Amida Buddha, whose name actually is Amitabha and Amitayus, the Buddha of infinite light and of infinite life. Light represents wisdom, or that sense of non-duality that we talked about from the Diamond Sutra. Life means eternal life, or infinite life, as is revealed to us in the 16th chapter of the Lotus Sutra. Well, that's my own opinion, that what we see in the Lotus Sutra is the revelation of the existence of Amida Buddha, who is the Buddha who, when he was a Dharmakara, made the vows in the presence of Lokesvara Raja Buddha to establish a pure land of bliss where anyone that believed in him or entrusted in him could be reborn, simply by saying his name, Namo Amida Butsu, saying his name in trust, which paradoxically, ironically, however you want to say it, is not really something we are doing. It's something he is doing. We are hearing his call. We are attending to and hearing the call of Amida that brings us into resonance, into alignment with this whole universe of Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Nirmanakaya, and represents, again, the non-duality, that it's not a question of sort of Amida being out there as a separate entity in the sense of, he's like a god in heaven. But again, we have to have a framework. We have to have a way of conceptualizing, a way of thinking about these things, because we are a thinking creature. So given that kind of rambling, let's just focus on the first three paragraphs of the Tannisho, where in this particular translation, Yenbo tells us that what Shinran said was this, quote, and this is a quote of Shinran saying something to himself. He's saying, "Saved by the inconceivable working of Amida's vow, I shall realize birth into the Pure Land." Now, to my mind, what's critically important in that particular assertion or statement or insight is inconceivable. It's inconceivable. The working of Amida's vow is not something we can get a handle on through any text or doctrine or scripture or sutra. It's just not something that we can get a handle on through this thinking mind, because thinking is by definition dualistic, okay? So he's acknowledging that here. But it's the way it's the way to think, it's the way we think that resonates with that reality most closely. And again, there may be another concept system that resonates. I wouldn't want to challenge that, because again, just like humans have come up with different languages in different parts of the world, they're going to come up with different ways of conceptualizing this fundamental truth. So he says to himself, saved by the inconceivable working of Amida's vow, I shall realize birth into the Pure Land. And from Shinran's perspective, birth in the Pure Land results in immediate attainment of Buddhahood. That's different than the earlier forms of Pure Land Buddhism. And that what the implication is that at that point in time, we have the option, we have the freedom to function in effect as a bodhisattva, as a cosmic bodhisattva, to be able to come back and influence and exercise influence in this world on behalf of beings who are suffering, in order to provide help and salvation to those whom we love, and those who may be who may have been more distant from us when we were alive. But it's that universal compassion. What Shinran talks about, he talks about Dharmakaya as suchness, which in a sense, again, knowing that we can't really pin down what the Dharmakaya is, suchness is that experience of here and now, the experience of reality as it is, and That is what some forms of Buddhism encourage people to try to attain and experience, such as in Zen Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism. It's more of a self-power oriented approach. But because Amida realizes that 99.9% of us are foolish beings, what Shinran calls foolish beings, filled with greed, anger, ignorance, or delusion, that we just can't experience or get in touch with Dharmakaya as suchness. So what happens is there is what Shinran calls Dharmakaya as compassionate means. And really what he's talking about here, in my view, is the skillful means as articulated in Chapter 2 of the Lotus Sutra, where the Sambhogakaya Buddha and the cosmic bodhisattvas, recognizing that there's a mysterious interconnectedness, that no being is totally separate from the rest, that's the whole point of the great vehicle, that therefore it makes no sense for any particular seeker, even with the most profound insight, to just sort of totally go his or her own way on behalf of his own serenity, peace of mind, enlightenment, nirvana, whatever you want to call it. That makes no sense. So compassion evolves from the wisdom. So Dharmakaya as suchness, in a sense, spawns this Dharmakaya as compassionate means. And that's what we see in the form of Amida Buddha and his primal vow. So he says this to himself. He says, saved by the inconceivable working of Amida's vow, I shall realize birth into the Pure Land, close quote. And then what Shinran says is this. To us, he's saying, the moment you entrust yourself thus, and entrustment is such a key aspect of Shinjin or faith, the moment you entrust yourself thus, so that the mind set upon saying the name of the Buddha, or Namo Amida Butsu, I take refuge in Amida Buddha, the moment you entrust yourself thus, so that the mind set upon saying the name arises within you, it arises because of Amida's influence on us. It is his power, not ours whatsoever. And that's the way we nullify, or is nullified, our pride, because we recognize our own limitations. The moment you entrust yourself thus, so that the mind set upon saying the name arises within you, you are brought to share in the benefit of being grasped by Amida, never to be abandoned. Grasped by Amida, never to be abandoned. Know, he says, know that the primal vow of Amida, the 18th vow in the larger sutra, the primal vow of Amida makes no distinction between people young and old, good and evil. Only the entrusting of yourself to it is essential. So nobody should be able to say, oh my God, well, I've done this, that, and the other thing that's so bad, there's no way I can be saved. That doesn't come into play here. That doesn't come into play at all, because this vow is so powerful. Shinran goes on to say, talking about the vow, it was made to save the person in whose karmic evil is deep-rooted and whose blind passions abound. Now, in a later section of this Tannisho, Shinran makes the point that just because there's an antidote doesn't mean you take a poison. In other words, you still work to try to live a moral life, and so this isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card to encourage antinomianism. But in any case, it's also the fact that, to the extent that one's own karma, in other words, the causes and conditions that have led up to who we are at a particular point in time, may have resulted in us saying or doing or thinking some things that have not been wholesome, that's not an obstacle to the efficacy of the vow. But again, Shinran warns on the other side of the coin that it's not appropriate to say to yourself, well, the vow, that's cool. It's taking care of me. Therefore, I've got a blank check. I can go out and do whatever in terms of evil. That's not Shin Buddhism. So he goes on in the third paragraph here in this first section 1 to say, thus, entrusting yourself to the primal vow requires no performance of good, no exercise of positive behaviors, no special knowledge of scriptures, no, particular rituals or religious activities. None of that is necessary. Now, you may exercise yourself in those things, but that's not related to salvation. That's not related to the dynamic associated with the vow's effects. Because again, entrusting yourself to the primal vow requires no performance of good, for no act can hold greater virtue than saying the name. I think what he communicates in his writings is that what Amida is doing is extending his virtues to us. He exercised himself for kalpas and kalpas, for eons, accumulating merit so that he would have the wherewithal to create this pure land of bliss. And so what he's doing in effect is transferring a portion of that merit to us so that we can overcome our own negative karma, which virtually all of us have plenty of it. He says, nor is there a need to despair of the evil you commit, for no act is so evil that it obstructs the working of Amida's primal vow. To have it said so explicitly, and again, to have Shinran's total body of writings to connect us back to the Mahayana larger worldview as articulated in the vast literature of Mahayana Sutras is, wow, what a legacy. What a legacy. So what it leaves me with is that sense that that we see in Buddhism at various times where it says we are so fortunate to be born as a human, where we can, have the ability to be exposed to this Dharma, and how fortunate we are to be exposed to this Dharma, this Buddha Dharma, that leads us to the potential for relief from our suffering, relief from the requirement that we be perfect. Because, as a result of our thinking mind and our way of being able to have at least a partial view of where we are in the universe, it's so easy to be down on ourselves and to feel like, we're not worthwhile. Whereas Buddhism says we all have the Buddha nature, and it's through this process of Shinjin that Buddha nature comes to fruition. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.